Now, until recently, very few people have heard of Rokhl Auerbach. She was a remarkable woman who survived the Holocaust, and then she dedicated her whole life to preserving the memory of the victims. She was born in 1899. She died in 1976. And her life spanned many markers of the 20th century Jewish experience. She spent her earliest years, her childhood years, in a backwoods village, not a shtetl, but a village in rural Podolia, now in Ukraine, populated mostly by Poles and Ukrainians. She then moved to Lvov, then in Poland, now in Ukraine, where she studied psychology at the Jan Kazimierz University. In 1932, she left Lvov for Warsaw, where she worked as a journalist, was active in Yiddish literary circles, and had a tempestuous relationship with the brilliant Yiddish poet Itzik Manger. When Germany attacked Poland in 1939 and Warsaw was heavily bombed, Auerbach survived the siege, and she was preparing to leave for her hometown of Lvov, which was occupied by the Soviets. But at the last minute, just as she was about to get on a train, the Jewish historian Emanuel Ringelblum called her. Now, many of you know Ringelblum is the person who organized the secret archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. And of the 60 or so people that Ringelblum eventually brought into the archive, there were only 3 survivors, and Auerbach was one of those survivors. But anyway, Ringelblum is calling her and saying, you can't leave. Not everybody has a right to leave. We need people like you to stay in Warsaw. We need people to help run the refugee relief, the soup kitchens. And so Auerbach stayed in Warsaw. This was to be a very fateful decision. And she was in charge of one of the biggest soup kitchens in the Warsaw Ghetto. And there she met a wide range of people, ran the gamut from well-known writers to beggars. And as Ringelblum got to know her better, he then recruited her to work in that secret archive. And one of the first essays that Auerbach wrote for the archive was a description of that soup kitchen. And I just want to say at this point that Auerbach's writings in the Warsaw Ghetto, and then her writings after she left the Warsaw Ghetto, she was lucky enough to get back most of them. When the milk cans of the archive were dug up after the war, and then when the hidden writings in the Warsaw Zoo were dug up in 1945, Auerbach was able to get back almost everything that she wrote during the war. And after she moved to Israel, she rewrote them, and she published 2 books of memoirs, which I recently translated. But anyway, back to the Warsaw Ghetto. Auerbach is now a manager of a soup kitchen, which is feeding 2,000 people a day. And she's giving us a gripping behind-the-scenes look at the ghetto's desperate battle against hunger. Now, the stark statistics were bad enough, but statistics could only register the number of deaths. What Auerbach did, like other members of the Oynik Shabbos, was to ensure that these people who died of starvation would be remembered for who they were and not just for how they died. And I want you to remind you that in the Warsaw Ghetto, if you just depended on that bowl of soup that you got every day, you might have 600 or 700 calories a day, which meant that you would starve to death. It would take longer, but the outcome would still be the same. And so all the soup kitchens did was to drag out the process. Now, if you were lucky enough to have another source of food that would lengthen the odds that you would survive for a while. But the soup kitchens themselves were only a half measure, and Auerbach was in constant despair. What am I doing? All this work that we're putting into the soup kitchens, does it really matter? But she wrote these amazing descriptions of the people that she encountered every day as they went in to get their bowl of soup. She described them both as individuals and as members of a community. She gave us a story of what we might call the social history of hunger by presenting the soup kitchen as a microcosm of human relationships and human choices. So we could now understand that the Jews who came to the soup kitchen, who ate there and who slowly died off, were not an undifferentiated mass. They were people. Each of the 2,000 daily customers in each family, they had their own idiosyncrasies, their own history, their own identity. And Auerbach deftly caught the phrases and the hablets that made them memorable. I just want to read you one description that from the Warsaw Testament, from the translated memoirs that were just published. It's about a family of sisters that Auerbach got to know. And now I'm going to start to read. I remember the Koberner family, 3 sisters, who managed to rescue a fine aluminum pot from what had once been a home and a life. In the early days, one of the sisters would come to get soup for all 3. Maybe the others were working somewhere. I didn't really know the family at first, but a half a year later, a woman approached me. She had a chit and was carrying the pot. My sister's sick, she told me. Our kitchen was serving about 500 to 600 soups a day at that time. The woman who doled out the soup, Miss Helena, knew all the consumers. She served them with a smile and a warm word. She knew about their lives and their troubles. She asked the new sister how the older one was doing. And so it was. One sister took the other's place. A while later, Helena informed me that the third sister was standing in the soup line. So now the second sister no longer had the strength to come. Only the pot remained as before, well cleaned and glistening brightly. That pot told volumes about a way of life, about a tidy home, about the dignified decline of yet one more Jewish family. So this is an example of her real journalistic talents, her wonderful reportage. And much of the power of Auerbach's reportage stemmed from her ability to navigate and straddle cultural boundaries from a life that included different worlds, the village where she spent her childhood, the Jewish shtetl that she got to know very well, the city where she was a journalist. She was equally fluent in Yiddish and Polish. She lived among Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews. She knew Galicia, but she also knew Warsaw. She was equally at home with religious and secular people. She was at home with diaspora nationalists and with Zionists. While she was part of the Jewish literary elite, she could still find a common language with the Jewish masses. Now, living cheek by jowl as a child with Polish and Ukrainian neighbors, she felt an unmistakable bond with her Slavic environment. And that complex relationship between Jews and non-Jews in the Polish-Ukrainian borderlands, which was marked by kind of a nuanced interplay of intimacy and alienation, sympathy and enmity, neighborly tranquility and bouts of sudden violence. All this left a permanent imprint on her personality. She believed later on, she believed that those childhood surroundings, those childhood experiences helped save her life. And I quote, "How did I survive on the Aryan side of Warsaw, pretending to be Polish, when hundreds of other Jews perished? It certainly was not because I was smarter What helped me were my early years growing up in a village. Those close ties with non-Jews left a mark on my personality. What rubbed off on me was that rural Slavic temperament. In March 1943, just before the outbreak of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and after 300,000 Jews had already been murdered in the gas chambers of Treblinka, Auerbach procured a fake Polish ID, posed as a Polish woman, and lived in German-occupied Warsaw, where she became an intrepid courier for the Jewish underground, passing money, passing messages, risking her life every day. When the war was over, in post-war Poland, she joined the Central Jewish Historical Commission and did pioneering historical research, one of the first people to write about Treblinka, for example, in 1950, by which time Poland had become a Stalinist communist dictatorship. She went to Israel, and in Israel, she began a new and very important career at Yad Vashem. She started the survivor testimony division at Yad Vashem. She emphasized the importance of listening to the victims and not just reading the history of the perpetrators. And she played a very important behind-the-scenes role during the planning of the Eichmann trial, where she urged Gideon Hausner, the chief prosecutor, to put survivor testimony front and center. Rather than just focus on Eichmann's specific activities in the Nazi bureaucracy, the trial should educate Israelis about what it really meant to be a Jew under Nazi occupation. And in this way, the trial succeeded brilliantly. There was a real difference between the Nuremberg trial and the Eichmann trial. The Nuremberg trial was based largely on documents. The Eichmann trial was based largely on survivor testimony. And then after she retired from Yad Vashem, in the last years of her life, she reworked her wartime writings, and she published 2 volumes in Yiddish. One volume appeared before she died. A second one appeared posthumously. And as I said, that's what I translated as Warsaw Testament. Among those wartime writings that Auerbach was able to compose, and I'm just going to give you samples of her writing, there was a remarkable essay entitled Yizkor, or Remember. She wrote it in November 1943. By this time, the ghetto was just a heap of rubble. The Jews were all gone. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising had been suppressed. And so on a dreary day in November, she's riding on a streetcar in Aryan, Warsaw, with her fake ID. And by now, of course, every day the Germans are carrying out public executions of Polish hostages on the Warsaw streets. When the Polish underground killed a German, the Germans would then shoot 100 hostages. And it was in those very sad times that on the trolley car, a Polish woman sitting across from Auerbach suddenly begins to weep. The Germans had just shot her son, and she cried, my son, over and over. And Auerbach thought to herself, this woman can at least publicly grieve. I, and now I quote, may neither groan nor weep. I may not draw attention to myself in the street, and I need to groan, I need to weep, not 4 times a year, which is when Jews say the Yizkor prayer. I feel the need to say Yizkor 4 times a day. How do you grieve for the 500,000 Jews of Warsaw. On that night, that same night, she went back to her room on Smolna Street. Her landlady had no idea that Auerbach was really Jewish, and she begins to write that essay that she entitles Yizkor. And as she groped for images to find the right words to describe the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe, she suddenly believed that she found the right way to do it. And she uses the example of a flood. And I quote, "I saw a flood once in the mountains. Wooden huts torn from their foundations were carried above the raging waters. One could see lighted lamps in them, men, women, children in cradles tied to ceiling beams. Other huts were empty inside, but one could see a tangle of arms waving from the roof like branches blowing in the wind, waving desperately toward heaven, toward the river banks for help. At a distance, one could see mouths gaping, but one could not hear the cries because the roar of the waters drowned out everything." And that's how the Jewish masses flowed to their destruction at the time of the deportations, sinking as helplessly into the deluge of destruction. And even if for one of the days of my life I should forget how I saw you then, my people, desperate and confused, delivered over to destruction, may all knowledge of me be forgotten, my name be cursed, like those traitors who are unworthy to share your pain. And this is what she did for the rest of her life, to make sure that those people be remembered. Now, why does she begin with the image of a natural disaster, of a flood? I think that as she wrote this, she could guess, she could intuit what people who weren't there, the questions they would ask after the war. Dumb questions. What had happened to those millions of Polish Jews? Why did they let themselves get fooled? Those tough, bright, resourceful Jews, why didn't they resist? By using the imagery of a flood, of a natural disaster, and David Roski's once pointed this out, she anticipated those questions. Why didn't they resist? Can you criticize the reactions of people swept away in a sudden flood or a tsunami? No, the Holocaust was not a meta-historical event. It had to be studied in detail, but its enormity was too horrible, too unprecedented to allow for glib theories and facile questions that might compromise the memory of the Jewish masses that she cherished so deeply. Few memoirists told the story of the Warsaw Ghetto with as much passion and insight as Auerbach did. Few worked more diligently to persuade historians, lawyers, and the wider public to listen, really listen, to the testimony of the survivors. And remember not just the famous names, but also the ordinary people who went to their deaths. She urged her listeners not to forget their names, their foibles, their hopes and dreams, the little worlds that were destroyed along with them. She asked her readers to remember aspects of the Warsaw Ghetto that tended to fade into obscurity. The soup kitchens, the children's libraries, the house committee fundraisers, the chamber concerts, the choir rehearsals, young teenagers flirting at work and finding first love. At a time when the Warsaw Ghetto uprising emerged as the symbol of Jewish resistance and heroism during the Holocaust, it was Auerbach who pleaded with the wider public to remember the writers and poets along with the fighters, to respect the importance of cultural and spiritual resistance alongside armed resistance, and to ponder not just the trauma of mass murder, but also the deep wound of cultural genocide. The Germans committed a double murder, not just the physical destruction of the Jews, but the erasure of their Yiddish speech and cultural legacy. This is a heart-wrenching and fascinating story. It's about people who would be totally forgotten today had it not been for Auerbach. Now, as I said, before the war, Auerbach's studied psychology in the university. And this was one of her chief intellectual interests. And one of the things that makes her writing special is not just the history and the description, although that's good, but her interest in what one might call the phenomenology of the Holocaust. How did people experience the unfolding disaster, the transition into the ghetto, the worsening conditions in the ghetto, the beginning of the deportation, the uncertainty, the delusions, the hope, the panic, the despair. What happens when you're confronted with the unthinkable and you don't want to believe it? And Auerbach stressed how the Germans skillfully used psychological weapons to effect the destruction of Warsaw Jewry and to use the Jews' strengths against them. The Germans played with the Jews and with their natural human instincts of self-preservation and hope. In her brilliant observations of the mass hysteria that gripped the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1942, when the Jewish police were rounding up 7,000 people a day to be shoved into the trains, Auerbach described how the very qualities that had served Jews so well in the past, practicality, pragmatism, hard-headedness, seichel, that Yiddish word which means common sense, brains, smarts, that Jewish natural optimism, now all combined to accelerate the journey into the abyss. That natural optimism we Jews have suffered before will get through this. Wir werden sie überleben. We will survive. Seichel, let's buy time. We will give them bribes. We'll give them gifts. We'll work hard for the Wehrmacht. Why would they want to kill us if we're so useful? Auerbach delved into the riddle of how Jews let themselves be fooled, how they failed to grasp the Nazi plan, not to blame them, but in fact to explain why they behaved the way they did. And I quote, now she's describing those tough Jewish workers from the Warsaw streets who before the war would beat up any anti-Semite who had dared to come into the Jewish neighborhoods. And now they were all stampeded into the trains. And Auerbach is trying to understand this. And I quote, still other Jews, the broad-shouldered, deep voice with powerful hands and hearts, artisans, workers, wagon drivers, porters, Jews who with a blow of their fists could floor any hooligan who dared enter their neighborhoods. Where were you when your wives and children, when your old fathers and mothers were taken away? What happened to make you run off like cattle stampeded by fire? Was there no one to give you some purpose in the confusion? You were swept away by the flood, together with those who were weak. And then, of course, she implies the question, would other peoples, not Jews, confronted with a similar massive assault have acted better? She didn't think so. Did the Warsaw Jews eventually recover from the shock and fight back? Yes, obviously. Should one blame the Jewish masses for not having fought back earlier? Only those who had not been there, Auerbach implied, would do so. Was armed resistance the only way the Jews could stand up to the Germans? Absolutely not. The story of Rokhl Auerbach also reminds us how important so-called cultural resistance was. And one of the most successful examples of cultural resistance was the Oynik Shabbos archive, the secret archive that Ringelblum organized in the Warsaw Ghetto. One of Ringelblum's teachers, Isaac Schipper, said just before he was murdered in Majdanek, what we know of murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. And Ringelblum said to himself, even if we don't live to see it, we will bury time capsules full of documents, and future historians will write about us on the basis of Jewish and not German sources. Imagine if the archive had never been found, the 500,000 Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto would have been remembered as a mass of faceless, nameless victims. The historians would have written about the perpetrators, but they could not have written about the Jews. But thanks to the archive and thanks to the work of people like Rokhl Auerbach, we know that there was a community. We know that these were people who did everything they could to fight back through self-help, through culture, through libraries, through education. Auerbach explicitly tells us that one should not contrast armed resistance and cultural resistance, but that it was part of the same process. And I just want to finish by reading one more description, which is, I think, rather typical of these memoirs. She's describing the efforts to set up children's libraries in the Warsaw Ghetto. And I quote here, mostly because of health concerns, it was necessary to set aside separate stocks of books to lend out to children in the refugee shelters and child care centers. Basha Berman, she's talking about, also had a special supply of books for children who suffered from scabies. Despite the best efforts of their teachers and caregivers, many of the children in the refugee shelters and child care centers lived in frightful conditions. Most had no warm clothing to wear in winter. They had no shoes. They lived in unheated rooms. But those kids loved to read. To get books, they would dispatch special delegates fitted out in whatever warm clothes they and their friends could rustle up. On certain days, the kids from the refugee centers would visit the libraries. Their appearance, as well as a peculiar, unpleasant odor, left no doubt where they came from. They'd show up, focused and serious, in order to arrange a book. They stretched out their shriveled little hands to touch the only relief available to them. In some of the refugee centers where the children were not able to read because of the freezing cold in the unheated rooms, the library would organize a collective reading aloud. Basha used to speak about the teacher Shapurko in the center on Volna 16. The teacher would read aloud. The children would curl up closer to each other under the blankets with wistful expressions on their faces. They would listen to a story about a far-off journey, about an adventure that took place under distant skies in the warm climes of Africa and Asia. Among the children that Basha worked with, one stood out from the rest. This kid named Meir simply devoured books. Once Meir returned a book with lice crawling along the inside pages, but the library staff did not get angry. It was not his fault that the lice crept over the book, just as they crept over his emaciated body. But it became clear that disinfecting the books was a problem for the library.